When you think about it, the social sciences have had a somewhat checkered reputation. The reason is that the social sciences deal with the study of human society and social relationships. And the trouble is, social phenomena are simply not as readily visible or measurable as natural phenomena. Imagine studying the following natural phenomena: trees, rocks, elephants, planets, cells, energy, gravity. Now compare them to these examples of social phenomena that a social scientist investigates: poverty, marriage, sexism, religion, democracy. Doing natural science sounds a lot simpler and much more straightforward than doing social science, doesn't it? As a result, compared to the natural sciences, the social sciences have had a rough and longer time getting proper recognition as a legitimate science. It comes as no surprise then that in response to these challenges, social scientists have in the past tried, and in fact some continue to do so, to mimic the natural sciences by applying the conventions and standards of the natural sciences to their methods. The kind of social sciences that emerged from such an approach understandably tended to be positivist, focusing almost exclusively on what was observable and even measurable, but with, as expected, often spotty results. Social phenomena, after all, do not always lend themselves to being directly observed, much less quantified. And if they do, they end up getting distorted, reduced only to their measurable components. For example, learning can be operationally defined as a permanent change in one's behavior. Now that's a very convenient definition, because behavior is one aspect of learning that is readily observable and even measurable. But is there learning when there is no such external manifestation? I think most of us will say yes. But note how the positivist and behaviorist definition for learning would tend to deny that. Partly as a reaction to the challenges and failures of this positivist approach, an alternative school of thought about the social sciences emerged, responding to the challenges and difficulties of applying the scientific method to the social world by adopting an interpretivist or hermeneutic approach. They rejected the conventions and methods of the natural sciences, believing, correctly, that they need not mimic physicists and chemists because the objects of their investigation are completely different. Social scientists of this particular persuasion have completely given up on any attempt at coming up with generalizations and causal laws, insisting that in the social world, what is crucial is interpretation and meaning. In short, as American psychiatrist Milton H. Erickson wrote, every case is a universe of one. There is no point in even trying to make generalizations. In other words, according to the school of thought in the social sciences, relevance is much more important than rigor. But how can the social sciences claim to be scientific if their investigations can lead at best to an understanding only of individual cases and not of the world? Now, between the positivist and interpretivist camps, we find the critical realist approach to the social sciences, proposed and developed by Roy Bhaskar in his seminal book, The Possibility of Naturalism. As the title of the book suggests, Bhaskar argues that contrary to the claims of the interpretivists, social naturalism is possible and in fact necessary. The natural and the social sciences should share the same assumptions about reality and knowledge, and we should be able to explain social phenomena with the same scientific rigor as the natural sciences. Unlike the interpretivist school, the critical realist brand of social sciences acknowledges the possibility and value of making generalizations. There is value in generalization. Otherwise, if all our science can do is tell us about individual events, it's not going to be a very helpful or valuable science, is it? However, contrary to the positivists, precisely because of its object of study, this naturalism needs to take on a form distinct from the naturalism of the natural sciences. The reason is Bhaskar's central thesis that it is the nature of the object that determines the science proper to its study. Because social reality is not the same as natural reality, it follows that the sciences required for its study need to be in some ways different from the natural sciences. A proper and adequate social science needs to take into account the characteristics of social phenomena that are not found in natural phenomena, but are peculiar and unique only in the social world. To understand what these features are, it's probably best to compare social phenomena with natural phenomena. We already have our illustrative list of social phenomena: society, poverty, marriage, sexism, religion, and democracy. This list includes different types of social phenomena: social structures, legal institutions, ideologies, and beliefs. As mentioned earlier, their first defining feature would be their empirical inaccessibility. Unlike natural reality, they cannot be directly observed. We can perceive them, but only through their effects. In other words, not through empirical observation, but only through empirical inference. That's the first characteristic. Second, unlike such natural objects as mountains, trees, and planets, social phenomena are inherently, necessarily socially produced. This means that you can't have social phenomena without human agents. Think, for example, society without people, poverty without poor families, marriage without married couples, religion without believers. You can't. A social phenomenon is always mediated by agency, contingent on present and previous human activity. As Bhaskar tells us, nothing happens in society save in virtue of something human beings do or have done. Or put another way, no people, no structure. Social phenomena can only be present in their effects and only through their effects, through the activities of human agents. In short, they are always necessarily mediated by human agency. Here we echo Durkheim, who says, without human activity, nothing in society could have its genesis, continuation, or change. This would be the second defining characteristic of the social world: agency mediation. For example, the institution of marriage continues to shape our society for as long as people are still getting married. But what do you think will happen if one day, hypothetically speaking, the whole world simply decided to stop getting married altogether? Will we still have the social institution of marriage? You see, when it is no longer practiced, marriage will no longer have much impact on society. But it will continue to exist because, as we have learned, social phenomena are also intransitive. While every phenomenon in the social world is socially produced, once produced, it becomes an autonomous referent, not simply depending on the agent or act investigating or reproducing it. So the properties of social phenomena are not dependent on current activities, but are the emergent and accumulated consequences of past actions of past agents. To quote Archer, these structures exist not because of these people here present, but because of the activities of those long dead. The third distinguishing feature of social phenomena, therefore, is their activity dependence. But note that this activity dependence is in the past tense. the enablements and constraints of social phenomena are not exclusively dependent on current actions of current agents. One helpful image we can use here is that of a hand-me-down garment with all its stitches and patches that is collected in time. To understand how a social phenomenon is activity-dependent, we need to pay attention to all the adjustments, additions, and changes that it has undergone through time. Finally, the fourth characteristic that differentiates social phenomena from their natural counterparts is their concept dependence. Everything in the social world is affected by our conceptualization of it, and it changes with our understanding. But note that social reality is not exhausted by our conceptualization, nor is it necessarily equivalent to it because we can be wrong. In short, just as the enablements and constraints of social phenomena are not dependent on current practice, neither is their causal efficacy limited by contemporary conceptualizations, whether or not these conceptualizations are correct, and even whether or not we have any conceptualization of them at all. Let's go back to our example of marriage. Whether you agree with it or not, marriage has undergone a radical change in recent times, so that an increasing number of countries today is now considered a formal, legally binding contract, not just between a man and a woman, but also for same-sex couples. This change in the legal institution of marriage is very much linked to, and in fact is made possible, by a corresponding change in the contemporary world's conceptualization of marriage. To summarize, social phenomena have four defining characteristics that distinguish them from natural phenomena. Social phenomena are only empirically inferred and are necessarily agency-mediated, activity-dependent, and concept-dependent. We need to keep these in mind if we want to be able to do a proper and adequate investigation of our social world. The main goal of the critical realist social scientist is to describe and explain social phenomena. To understand what it means to describe phenomena, we will discuss the scientist's work of conceptualizing. And in order to clarify what it means to explain phenomena, we will discuss the scientist's task of theorizing. Note that by no means are we using these two terms loosely. To conceptualize and to theorize are often used synonymously, but here we are using conceptualizing only in relation to the description of phenomena, and we are reserving the term theorizing for explanation. In short, when we form a concept, we focus on the what of a phenomenon, and when we theorize, we are after its why, namely its causes. Let's first talk about the first goal of the social scientist, description. Description in the sciences, whether social or natural, always entails conceptualization, which Dahnemark in his book Explaining Society describes as the most central social scientific activity. Now, what goes into concept formation? What does it look like and sound like? Again, it will probably be best to do this by comparing the natural and social sciences. As we said earlier, one difference between natural and social phenomena is that things like trees, rocks, elephants, planets, and cells are directly observable, some of them, of course, with the help of technology. Other natural phenomena like energy and gravity are invisible, but they remain no less measurable. In the natural sciences, therefore, conceptualization is anchored firmly on observation and measurement because the objects of their study lend themselves easily to these modes of data gathering. Now let's talk about the objects of social investigations. Unlike natural phenomena, poverty, marriage, sexism, religion, and democracy can be perceived only in an indirect way, only through their effects, and they are measurable only to a very, very limited degree, if at all. No doubt, description in the social sciences also begins with data, albeit gathered using means other than mere observation and measurement. But precisely because of the peculiar nature of social phenomena, conceptualization in the social sciences is somewhat trickier than in the natural sciences. First of all, conceptual formation necessarily requires abstraction for both the natural and social sciences. For example, concepts of the natural kind include air pressure, density, energy, and gravitation. For examples of social concepts, we can simply refer to our earlier list: poverty, marriage, sexism, religion, and democracy. Now, whether in the case of natural or social concepts, when we form concepts, we are actually cognitively isolating one aspect of the phenomenon from all its other aspects. For example, we focus on the air pressure and density in things, or we zero in on poverty in society and marriage in social life. The important question, though, is what are concepts for? Are they mere mental models that represent reality to help us understand it? Or do they actually refer to something real out there? For a scientist with a positivist persuasion, concepts are merely a means to an end, formulated for the purpose of establishing measurable variables and ensuring objectivity and replicability. In the positivist approach, therefore, conceptual definitions are necessary, but only for operationalization, for making phenomena measurable. For the critical realist, however, conceptual abstraction is not just about coming up with mental models to allow us to measure a phenomenon. Rather, it is about identifying a real and essential aspect of a concrete phenomenon. When critical realists set out to describe a phenomenon, they are looking for what it is exactly that makes the phenomenon what it is and not something else. So a critical realist concept should identify a real, underlying structure or mechanism that may not be directly observable but can be inferred from its effects. For instance, we can't see democracy or gender, but these concepts help us recognize them as underlying but efficacious causal mechanisms at work in society. You could say that when we engage in concept formation, we're actually conducting a process of structural analysis. That is, we are analyzing a phenomenon so that we can identify its often empirically hidden causal structure. Needless to say, our concept formation is inevitably regulated by our underlying meta-theory, whether we are conscious of it or not. To align our conceptual formation to a critical realist meta-theory, our concepts ought to be devoid of any reductionism and firmly anchored on emergence. If you recall, emergence recognizes different types and levels of causal mechanisms, ranging from the most basic to the most complex. To reduce the higher order and more complex causal mechanisms to the lower order and more basic ones is to distort the phenomenon we are trying to understand. Because our concept may be simpler and easier to understand, but it fails to take into account the essential causal mechanisms that make a phenomenon what it is. For example, if we want to describe human consciousness, if physicists, chemists, and biologists put all their heads together, they may be able to marshal all their sciences to conceptualize it, but their concept will be able to account only for its physical, chemical, and biological components. Their concept will surely fall short of describing consciousness in terms of what is most peculiar and unique to human consciousness. That is, human consciousness as a psychosocial phenomenon, more than just physical, more than just chemical, and more than just biological. Let's take another example: gender identity. Based on our observations, a number of individuals seem to experience and express their gender identity in a way that is not quite consistent with their sex at birth. A reductionist conceptualization of gender identity would conflate it with biological sex, defining one's internal sense of self as nothing but the product of one's birth-assigned sex, so that any lack of alignment would just be labeled pathological. Given such a persuasion, gender identity would not warrant a separate concept from biological sex. However, there seems to be growing scientific evidence that while gender identity is rooted in biological sex, the two are not identical. So a critical realist should at least consider the possibility of gender identity as a distinct psychosocial causal mechanism deserving in its own right of a conceptualization distinct from biological sex. This concept formation in the critical realist fashion happens to a very specific mode of inference. Let's say we have data about a number of people experiencing gender dysphoria. That is, a disconnect between their biological sex and their internal sense of their sexual selves. To formulate a concept, we cannot use the usual modes of inferences, namely induction or deduction. Induction simply won't work because we are not making a conclusion about the general population based on a limited number of cases. Nor can we employ deduction because we are not applying a universal or general law to individual cases. Concept formation here calls for a different kind of inference called abduction. Abduction is a type of scientific reasoning often described as inference to the best explanation. So given our data, for instance, what is our best guess for an explanation of a concrete social phenomenon? In the case of gender identity, given these particular individuals' experiences, what could be the cause or causes of gender dysphoria? Could it be, the critical realist should wonder, an underlying psychosocial causal mechanism called gender identity? Not only does such a conceptualization of gender identity avoid biological reductionism, which conflates it with biological sex, but just as importantly, it is equally opposed to today's more fashionable but psychologically reductionist conception of gender identity as being nothing more than a matter of personal choice or preference. In his book, Explaining Society, Dahnermark writes that abduction is the effort to redescribe or interpret a single event or occurrence as an expression of a more general phenomenon. This task of redescription or reinterpretation requires creative imagination, and the output may come in the form of a metaphor or a mathematical model. My personal favorite examples come from the natural sciences and are well-known abductions from the two giants in the field of physics, namely Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, when they were both mulling over gravity. An apple famously gave Newton his aha moment when he stumbled upon the revolutionary idea that whatever it was that was pulling apples to the ground on Earth might well be the same invisible force that was keeping the planets in orbit around the sun. This conceptualization of gravity as an invisible force, a string, if you wish, that pulls objects together, was Newton's genius moment of abduction. Now, over 2 centuries later, with access to new masses of data previously unavailable to Newton, Einstein reimagined gravity not so much as an invisible force, as Newton had done, but as a 4-dimensional space-time fabric that is warped by massive objects pulling other objects towards themselves. This was a radically novel abductive moment that reconceptualized gravity in a way that more comprehensively accounted for all the accumulated data about gravity. Now, these two different conceptions of gravity do not yet actually explain the phenomenon of gravity, but they do already contain the seeds of explanations that Newton and Einstein later developed about gravity. To explain phenomena, we need to move from conceptualizing to theorizing. After all, a theory or a theoretical framework defines the relationships between concepts in a coherent and rigorous system. To develop a theory, however, our scientific reasoning needs to shift from mere abduction to retroduction. Abduction is the creative leap that generates a plausible hypothesis about an underlying cause. Retroduction is the rigorous inference that specifies the necessary unobservable structure and mode of operation of the hypothesized causal mechanism. In short, abduction tells us what the cause might be, but retroduction defines the how the structure of that cause produces the phenomenon. In retroduction, attention is focused on uncovering the ontological structures of reality. So we ask a modified Kantian question: what should the world be like for this phenomenon to be possible? It is retroduction that enables us to craft a fuller explanatory account of a given phenomenon based on our abductive concept. Let's go back to gravity. Newton's description of it as an invisible force eventually led to his explanation of how gravity works, concisely represented by his famous law of universal gravitation. Of course, Einstein's reconceptualization of gravity as a space-time fabric led to a corresponding revision of the explanation for gravity, not to mention an overhaul of Newton's mathematical model. Now, what do abduction and retroduction look like in the social sciences? Here's an example. Social scientists have observed a significant difference in the way those in East Asia, specifically in China, Japan, and South Korea, conduct their business practices compared to the West. A big number of investments, partnerships, and other large-scale transactions are undertaken with few, if any, formal legal contracts. Yet despite a relatively weak rule of law, these business relationships survive and even flourish over long periods of time, exhibiting a surprisingly high level of mutual trust and accountability. Using abduction, social scientists have conceptualized a network-based relational mechanism unique to these Confucian societies, a pre-existing social structure of relational governance. In Mandarin Chinese, it is called Guanxi. And then, through retroductive reasoning, it has been posited that in the East, it is not so much legal enforcement that makes possible smooth and successful business relationships and transactions as it is the case in the West. Rather, it is Guanxi, this unspoken social agreement about reciprocal obligations and long-term reputation that accounts for it. Unlike the West, violations of this implicit contract in East Asia lead not so much to lawsuits, but more painfully and therefore more effectively in the East, to loss of face and exclusion from the business network. In summary, we engage in abductive and retroductive reasoning to describe and explain phenomena, and we do that by coming up with concepts and theories to identify a social structure, generative mechanism, or causal law. Speaking of causal laws, it is through abduction and retroduction that we begin to appreciate the kind of generalization that critical realists ought to aim for. We are not trying to achieve empirical generalization, which is the inductive process of making a general claim about the entire population based on a limited number of observed cases. Rather, the critical realist goal of generalization is the abductive and retroductive process of making conclusions about tendencies of acting and behaving in society because of underlying causal structures or mechanisms. In short, the critical realist inference is not so much from the particular to the universal, but from the empirical to the causal and the real. Note the deliberate use of the word tendencies. As I hope we know by now, unlike the positivists, we critical realists understand that the real world, that is the world outside the science laboratory, is an open system. So we do not even try to predict events, precisely because there are many other causal powers that can influence what happens in the social world. The best findings we can ever hope for are not so much about actual outcomes, but about tendencies. A proper critical realist causal law might sound something like this. All things equal, given these conditions, causal mechanism X will most likely lead to event Y. In conclusion, the role of the social sciences is to help us understand social reality in all its complexity and messiness. Social investigations, if not well designed and not well conducted, run the risk of distorting their objects of investigation because they fail to take into account the peculiar nature of social phenomena that call for a different approach from the natural sciences. Moreover, the empirical sciences, both natural and social, are primarily theoretical enterprises. While the sciences should always be unequivocally anchored on our experiences of the world, their primary purpose is to help us understand that world, and this work is unapologetically theoretical. In order to describe and explain phenomena adequately and correctly, we must make our most educated guesses at the best possible explanation by resorting to abductive and retroductive reasoning. There is no going around it. After all, concepts and theories are inevitably the only language we can use to understand and explain the world.